What's up? I'm Philip M. Bailey, and this is States of America with USA Today. On today's show, after months of demonstrations and calls for justice, a grand jury in Kentucky announced its decision on the death of Breonna Taylor at the hands of Louisville police officers. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death looks to give the conservative majority a lock, likely for decades. And wildfires are once again a force of major destruction across the American West. Are they getting worse? That and a look ahead to next week's first presidential debate. Let's go. For 5 months, people across Louisville, Kentucky, and the rest of the country have said, arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor. This week, they got their answer. It was no. Here to discuss the fallout is activist Hannah Drake, a Louisville poet. Hannah, how are you?
I'm doing okay this morning, Philip. Thank you for having me on the show.
Hannah, let me ask you first and foremost, how do you feel personally about the Breonna Taylor case and the decision by Attorney General Daniel Cameron? You, of course, have been one of the activists at the front lines of this for more than 100 days. You've spoken at various events. People from across the country certainly rallied around this particular cause. How do you feel personally now that we know only one of the officers is being charged? And by the way, Brent Hankinson, that officer, is being charged with wanton endangerment. So not anything directly related to the death of Breonna Taylor.
It's devastating. It's when I heard the announcement, I was disgusted. I was frustrated, angry, mad, upset. It was a flurry of emotions, but it all pointed to a reminder that indeed Black lives do not matter in Louisville or in this nation.
Attorney General Daniel Cameron laid out a pretty methodical rationale or his reasoning for the ultimate decision by the grand jury. It's not clear whether or not the Attorney General pursued tougher charges against any of the officers, but he did indicate the two other officers who have been named who are still on the force, that would be Sergeant John Mattingly and Officer Miles Cosgrove, saying that they were acting in self-defense. How do you react to that, and how do others react to the Attorney General saying, look, this is not based upon emotion. It shouldn't be based upon emotion. It's based upon current law?
I think when you have Attorney General saying this should not be based on emotion, that's yet another slap in the face to Black women in Louisville. This was not emotion driven. Breonna Taylor was alive 1 minute, and in the next minute she was killed. Out of those 3 officers, someone there has murdered Breonna Taylor. And so we were asking for justice in that, to have him now be able to be charged with wanton endangerment for shooting into an apartment, and not even shooting into Breonna Taylor's apartment, is an insult to Black women. It's an insult to Black people. I'm very discouraged to hear that I've seen people say her walls got more justice. The walls in that apartment got more justice than Breonna Taylor did.
Where do we go from here? Is the focus now on the FBI doing something? Is the focus now on Mayor Greg Fisher in Louisville resigning? More legislative passing of different laws at the state level or local level in Louisville or Kentucky? Where do we go from here?
I actually think that many of us are not focused on the FBI's investigation. In fact, we are now focused on what we can change locally and statewide. And that certainly means getting out voting. That certainly means putting people in position that actually care about the progress of Louisville. I do not think, when we saw that letter from John Mattingly, I believe this is the culture of the LMPD. I do not think you policy change your way into officers that think like that. Seeing the humanity in me, certainly didn't see the humanity in Breonna Taylor. To say what they did was ethical and moral. It will never be ethical and moral to kill an innocent 26-year-old Black woman in her home. So I believe that from the top down in the police department, there needs to be some changes. Some people do need to be fired. You cannot write laws that will make people do the right thing and see that as a Black woman, I deserve to live. That is a heart issue. That is a heart and mind issue that needs to be reformed. And so I think Louisville has some cleaning house to do on the local level and the state level.
Let me ask you as a final question. Those who say, how did Breonna Taylor get wrapped up into this case? she shouldn't have been involved or even had a friendship with her ex-boyfriend, who was the focus of this drug investigation. You have obviously in your blog and other spaces, your poem spaces actually, has talked about this. The effort sort of to try to define Breonna Taylor as a woman, as a person, both by detractors and critics, but also by supporters. Speak to that, the nuance of that, right? Like the people who say she shouldn't have been involved with Jamarcus Glover in the first place, or, that sort of saying, if you're not involved with a drug dealer, this doesn't happen to you. But those saying this is an effort to sort of smear her name. Speak to that. This is in closing here.
There are many of us that have been in relationships with people that I do not want to be held accountable for now that we are no longer in relationship. I cannot be held accountable for my type of friends that I have. I think it speaks to who she is as a person, that she did not count people out, that the society has counted out. And so I think it's always a way for this city to justify somehow the murder of Breonna Taylor, to make her responsible for her murder, when in fact she wasn't responsible for it. The 3 officers that entered her home and this failed justice system is responsible for the death of Breonna Taylor.
Hannah Drake, Louisville poet extraordinaire. Thank you for joining us here on States of America.
Thank you, Philip.
When we return, the balance of the Supreme Court could be set for decades to come when President Trump will get his chance for a 3rd Supreme Court pick.
For conservatives, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reshape the Supreme Court.
Senate Republicans are rapidly coalescing around the idea of confirming President Trump's yet-to-be-named nominee to replace the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Senator Mitt Romney of Utah has had a combative relationship with Trump for years, but even he has embraced the idea of filling the seat with a more conservative justice before the November 3rd election. Here to discuss is Brianne Fonan Steele of the Des Moines Register and Nick Wu of USA Today. Guys, how are you?
All right.
Thanks for having us.
Let me first ask you, Nick. Romney saying he's in favor of this vote. Number one, was that a surprise? And number two, doesn't that pretty much clear the pathway for President Trump to get another Supreme Court seat filled?
It was not really that much of a surprise for Romney. I mean, a lot of this was up in the air. He held his cards pretty close. And as McConnell had told senators to do, Romney kept his powder dry. But despite the fact that he has rebuked the president previously and criticized him on a number of issues ranging from national security to even voting for one count of impeachment, the fact remains that Senator Romney is a conservative at heart and wanted to put conservative judges on the bench. And for conservatives, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reshape the Supreme Court, to put a 6-3 conservative majority there that could fundamentally alter the American political landscape.
Right. That was my point, I guess, Nick, was that, look, no matter what the relationship with President Trump might be, what's the point of having a Republican Party if you're missing this opportunity to have a permanent conservative majority on the court? Brianne, you got a great scoop from your senator there in Iowa. Describe, I guess, Chuck Grassley's perspective. He was thought of as more of an institutionalist, right, which is now the new word for trying to say, therefore, the sort of norms of how the Senate has run. Were you surprised when he pretty much said that 2016 rule, a way of doing things when we didn't, appoint Merrick Garland to the court when President Obama had a last minute pick there? Were you surprised that he changed his view as well?
Well, Chuck Grassley is a really interesting case for this. So if you all remember in 2016, when Barack Obama made his Supreme Court nomination, Merrick Garland, Chuck Grassley was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. And he really became the face of the Republican Party's efforts to hold that seat open, really leading the messaging at the time that the voters deserve a say, that this seat needs to be filled after we've elected a new president. And we know what the voters want. And so if you remember, that was 9 months before Election Day. And so Chuck Grassley had these very heated town halls around Iowa, people coming and yelling at him to change his position, people supporting him. They became very contentious. And so after that all settled and the seat was filled by President Donald Trump, Chuck Grassley told people here in Iowa, he told his constituents that I believe this should be the case regardless, and that if I am the chair of the Judiciary Committee in another year, in another election year when this comes up, I would not support putting in a nominee even for a Republican president, even if it's Donald Trump in an election year. And so it really did seem to a lot of his constituents that he'd come down firmly. But then when he announced this week that he will support going forward with these hearings, he did some parsing of words here and said, well, I'm no longer the chair of the Judiciary Committee, so it's not my call. It's getting people off of the sidelines. And when I say people right now, I mean Democrats. I think it's really motivating a lot of Democrats to get involved, to write a check for the first time, to start making phone calls, doing text banking. I think typically we think of the Supreme Court as being a really motivating force for Republicans. And we absolutely saw that in 2016. That's here in Iowa when people were still very unsure about President Trump and whether they could support him. This was the issue that got a lot of people on board. We need a conservative Supreme Court. So now we're seeing that on the other side.
Right, which has been Mitch McConnell's dream probably since he first entered the Senate when I was born. Let me ask both of you, who are the senators on the Republican side who benefit from bucking the party on this? Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, are the only two who have said, we don't feel comfortable with the idea of voting on a Supreme Court justice seat 47-something days before the election. Senator McConnell obviously saying, hey, look, we've had quick confirmations before, such as John Paul Stevens.
For someone like Susan Collins, who's relying on a lot of crossover votes in Maine, a state that's somewhat trending blue, she can benefit from being seen as independent or bucking the president on an issue like this. But say in a state like Colorado, where you have another Republican senator in a tough re-election race, Senator Cory Gardner, he's someone who's very much relying on the coattails of someone like Trump in order to win re-election here. Since in order to win his race, he'll need to activate the Republican base enough to push him over the
Right, he needs those Trump. Right.
Exactly. Or the same goes with someone like Tom Tillis in North Carolina, who very narrowly avoided a primary challenge earlier this year, but has now tacked hard to the right in order to win his re-election.
Right. Let me ask the both of you as a final question. Is there anything that Democrats can do here? The only viable option, I mean, there's no way for them to really stop the nomination process if Republicans have the 50 votes, which it now looks like Senator McConnell does have. The only thing I hear them really talking about is adding justices to the Supreme Court if Joe Biden wins the presidency and if they win the majority in the Senate. So two big ifs there, still two unknowns, which may not happen. Is there anything Democrats can do? I know, Breanne, you mentioned that this is activating Democrats and usually activates sort of right-leaning anti-abortion Republicans. Is there anything Democrats can do?
I mean, when you look at the dynamics of, Congress right now, it doesn't seem like there's much they're going to be able to do to block the president's nominee. But, even if you look electorally, how they're doing, that comes after an election. And so, it's really tough to see a path forward for Democrats where they would be able to successfully block a nominee here.
Well, Breanne Fanon-Steele of the Des Moines Register, Nick Wu of USA Today, thanks for joining us here on States of America.
Thank you.
Thanks.
After the break, a sneak peek at Tuesday's first presidential debate and the topics it will cover.
People who are voting in 2020 already have their opinions kind of locked in on both of these candidates.
So as you may know, our own Susan Page will be moderating the vice presidential debate on October 7th in Salt Lake City, Utah. So she'll be unable to join us on this program until after the debate. But she's left us in very capable hands with Anna Ashbrenner, USA Today's 2020 elections editor. Anna, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Well, let's jump right into this. Fox News host Chris Wallace is going to be moderating, I believe, the first presidential debate, and he's announced the topics he wants to discuss with President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. Are any of those topics sort of striking to you, surprising to you? And are there some maybe that are missing on that list?
When I saw what had come out, I wasn't super surprised. I think it's pretty indicative of what you've seen in polling that are among, the top priorities of registered voters.
Right. I believe the list, Anna, is Trump and Biden's records, the Supreme Court, COVID-19, the economy, and race and violence in our cities. Not necessarily race and the social justice protests against police brutality. Does that heading give you pause about the direction that Wallace is going? Or is that simply, look, you and I are in the news business, headlines don't always tell the intricacies or nuances of a story, that doesn't necessarily mean what the questions will be.
Right. I mean, do I think that could have probably been better phrased? Yes. But I'm hopeful that the questions will be framed in a way that they're relevant to both sides of the aisle and sort of the competing viewpoints people have on the, perceived violence and the level of that in different cities. So I'm hopeful. I think we've seen Chris Wallace do pretty good interviews in the past, and his reputation is pretty good. So I'm hopeful that it will be handled with the respect it deserves.
Do the debates matter, right? I mean, will these debates actually sway anyone? I mean, as long as no one makes a serious error, and even if they were to, I wonder if so much of the electorate with these two candidates is already in place. Do these debates matter? Do you have a feeling that maybe these debates, this go round of debates, won't matter as much as in previous cycles?
I think you're probably right. I think we've seen time after time in polling that the number of people who are undecided in this election just continues to get smaller and smaller the closer we get. I think most people who are voting in 2020 already have their opinions kind of locked in on both of these candidates. That being said, I think if you have a major gaffe, or if you say something, maybe that's totally out of left field or is offensive or just surprising and maybe odd to people, you could lose voters. But I think that compared to previous years, these might be a little less important than they have been.
Right. Well, Anna Ashbrenner, we finally got an editor on here, 2020 elections editor. Thank you for joining us here on States of America.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. When we come back, is a fire age in our future? Maybe not if some young environmental activists have their way.
We're creating the fire equivalent of an ice age.
Once again, the end of summer has brought large-scale wildfires to the West Coast, including parts of Oregon and Washington, in addition to California. This season could prove to be another extremely destructive, record-breaking season. Is it just climate change, or is there something more going on? President Trump has railed against forest management as part of the issue. Are these fires getting worse? Joining me to discuss this is Dr. Stephen Pine of Arizona State University and a fire historian, and Naina Agrawal-Hardin of the Sunrise Movement. Guys, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Doing well.
Let me start with you, Dr. Pine. We're not just seeing California and other large-scale fires here in the U.S., but I was reading a recent piece that I believe you were featured in. We're seeing it in the Arctic and Siberia, Argentina, Brazil. Tell me as a layman, I hear people say, oh, climate change is responsible for it, but I was a child of the 80s. Smoke Bear said only you can prevent forest fires. How is climate change connected to these raging fires across the world?
Well, in several ways. It's acting as a performance enhancer on places that are already prone to fire. So Australia, California, the boreal forest, and we're seeing larger, more frequent outbreaks. But it's also creating conditions for fire to go where it very rarely has appeared before. The Arctic tundra, Greenland, for heaven's sakes. And then it's interacting with other kinds of things. People are doing large-scale landscape changes like clearing in the Amazon, draining peatlands in Indonesia, or even large demographic changes, the depopulation of much of Mediterranean Europe, which is leaving lots of stuff to burn. So it's acting in different ways on existing conditions.
Naina, let me ask you as a follow-up to that. Look, I'm sure you are used to a lot of folks being skeptical about climate change overall, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you finding it difficult to explain to regular folks and selling it politically about how climate change is connected to wildfires?
Most of my work is with young people, and most of the young people I work with are acutely aware of these effects of the climate crisis. And if anything, I find myself having to communicate with them about how they can channel the grief and the fear that they are feeling right now into action.
I've seen, this is for both of you, I've seen some daunting, post-apocalyptic looking pictures of these red skies out in the West Coast. Step back from both of your professional positions. Give me more of the human aspect of this. I mean, I would think that would be really traumatic to walk out of the house and think you're on planet Mars, right, where the sky is completely orange or red. What effect is this having just on the day-to-day life of people out on the West Coast who are living nearby or in these communities where wildfires are devastating?
Well, I don't have to experience that personally. We're getting some of the smoke, but not at the same intensity. Part of it, I think, is the fear that the fires may encroach on your place and you may join those other refugees. And also the amount of smoke and the longevity of this kind of smoke, this sort of pall that settles in for a long time. It also happened in Australia, can really wear people down. And it is a public health issue.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you're asking about this because we don't talk about the very, very real human effects enough. I myself live in Michigan, but I've got a lot of friends out in California who they can't leave their houses because they've got asthma or pre-existing conditions and they can't breathe. And that is so scary, especially for young people, but for everybody. And it's also worth noting that people losing their lives, their livelihoods, their homes, it's disproportionately impacting marginalized communities, people who are poor and Black and brown people.
Correct.
One critical aspect of this that's not talked about enough is that incarcerated people in California have been asked to fight these fires for, wages, 53 cents an hour, next to no money. And because our prison system is a huge product of the systemic racism in our country, these are predominantly poor Black and brown inmates. And when Kamala Harris was Attorney General, she lobbied against releasing some of these prisoners. She was not really an ally to these incarcerated populations in California. And so we both have to consider what's going on with their climate plan and also consider what they are doing in terms of justice for marginalized communities, because those two struggles are really intimately connected.
Right. Dr. Pine, I don't know if you want to address the question of what the federal government or Governor Newsom should be doing directly. Did you want to chime in on that, or if I could move on? Or
well, very briefly, we don't have a fire problem. We have many fire problems, and they all have different solutions. Some of them are technically solvable. There's no reason to have power lines start fires. There's really no reason for houses and communities to burn at the scale we're doing. We solved that problem a long time ago. So there are a lot of things we can do very quickly. At the same time, we need to start in on getting our landscapes in better shape. And we need to be working on climate change.
Right.
We need to be doing all of them at the same time.
You're someone who has studied this pretty in depth. We talk about an ice age. We know what that was.
Sure.
You have warned about, and I think spoken about, a fire age. Explain that. I think it's called pyrocene is what you call it. Explain that to folks. I think a lot of people would think, it's another one of these liberal professors being all, post-apocalyptic and warning us of the doomsday. But explain to me, really, what are you worried about? And explain, what does the fire age look like in your view?
Well, humans, we're a uniquely fire creature on the planet. We have a species monopoly over fire. We've always used fire to change the environment and to try to make it more habitable for ourselves. But when you add in the sum of all the things we're doing, and you add in, and it's part of a continuous narrative, our turn to fossil fuels, and which put the whole process on afterburners. You add all of that together, and I think we're creating the fire equivalent of an ice age. We've got sea level changes, mass extinctions, all the things that climate change is doing. That also derives from our unique ability as a manipulator of fire, but also vast biogeographical shifts, and clearly people are going to be impacted as well.
Right. Well, Nana Agrawal-Harden of the Sunrise Movement and Dr. Stephen Pine of Arizona State University.
Yes,
Thanks for joining us on this episode of States of America, where we're having honest conversations on issues that matter most. See you next time.